All right, get ready because today we're diving into something you might not expect,
Oh,
a physics simulation
okay.
about pushing a file cabinet.
All right.
But stick with us because we're going to use this surprisingly insightful tool
Mm,
to uncover how even the most mundane actions
yeah,
are governed by the laws of physics.
that's right. We'll be exploring a website
Okay,
dedicated to open educational resources for physics,
cool.
and specifically we'll be focusing on their simulation that breaks down the forces involved in pushing an object.
I'm already intrigued. I've always wondered what's actually happening at a physics level when I struggle to move that heavy box in my attic.
Well, this simulation uses a file cabinet,
Yep.
but the principles apply to any object.
Oh,
It all starts with the fundamental forces and how they interact.
okay, so let's jump right in.
Okay.
The website starts by talking about Newton's first law
Right?
and uses some thought experiments to illustrate it.
Yeah.
Can you refresh our memory on what those are?
Absolutely. One experiment involves imagining pulling a playing card out from under a coin. The coin stays put due to inertia wanting to remain at rest. The card is pulled away so quickly that friction doesn't have time to act on the coin.
Oh, right. That's a classic demonstration of inertia. What's the other thought experiment they use?
The second one involves picturing yourself running at full speed and trying to stop instantly on a piece of tape. You can't do it
Right.
because your body wants to keep moving due to inertia. It requires time and force to overcome that momentum.
It's funny how these simple thought experiments can really make you think about the physics at play in our everyday lives.
Exactly. And that's what the simulation does so well.
Yeah.
It takes these seemingly abstract concepts and brings them to life visually.
All right, so how does this simulation actually represent these forces visually?
They use arrows, which is standard in physics diagrams.
Okay.
The length of the arrow indicates the strength of the force, and the direction of the arrow shows the direction the force is acting.
So longer arrow equals a stronger force.
Okay.
Got it. Now, the website does have an example diagram.
It does.
But it doesn't seem like we need to get bogged down in those specifics right now, right?
No, not really. The main takeaway is that forces can be visualized,
Okay,
which is key as we move into the actual file cabinet simulation.
great. Let's fire up that virtual file cabinet and see how it all works.
Yeah.
So what happens when we start to push this virtual cabinet?
The simulation breaks it down into stages
Okay.
to help us understand the different forces at play.
Mm-hmm.
We begin with the no-push stage. The cabinet is at rest, just sitting there.
Okay, so in this no-push stage, I'm guessing the forces acting on the cabinet are balanced, like gravity's pulling it down.
Right.
But the floor is pushing back up with an equal force keeping it stationary.
That's precisely it. It's a state of equilibrium where the forces are balanced,
Look,
resulting in no movement.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Now let's give this virtual cabinet a little nudge. What happens in the simulation when we apply a small push?
This is where static friction comes in. Static friction is the force that prevents an object from moving when it's at rest.
Right.
So initially the cabinet doesn't budge. Yeah.
Because the friction force is equal and opposite to the force you're applying.
So it's like an invisible tug-of-war between the force of your push and the force of static friction.
That's a great way to put it. And the simulation even provides a specific value where the cabinet finally starts to move. 4.905 newtons.
Wow.
This is the maximum force that static friction can exert before the object begins to move.
That's a cool detail. It brings a level of concreteness to this concept. So what happens once we overcome that static friction and the cabinet starts moving?
That's when kinetic friction takes over. Kinetic friction is the force that opposes motion while an object is moving.
Okay.
It's always less than static friction,
Mm-hmm.
which explains why it's easier to keep something moving than to get it started.
Ah, that makes so much sense. It's like that feeling when you're trying to push a heavy piece of furniture. It takes a lot of effort to get it moving, but once it's going, it's a bit easier to keep it sliding. Exactly. The simulation shows this difference clearly. The kinetic friction force is only 3.038 newtons, which is less than the 4.905 newtons needed to overcome static friction.
Wait, so even though the cabinet's moving across the floor, there's still friction acting on it?
Absolutely. And that's a common misconception. People often think that if something is moving at a constant velocity, there are no forces acting on it.
Right.
But constant velocity simply means the forces are balanced. There's still friction working against the cabinet's motion, but it's being counteracted by the force you're applying, resulting in that constant movement.
So it all comes down to the interplay between balanced and unbalanced forces.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to...
Newton's second law. Force equals mass times acceleration.
Right.
This simulation is a great way to see this law in action. When the forces are balanced, there's no acceleration. But when there's an unbalanced force, like when we overcome static friction or apply more force than the kinetic friction, the object accelerates.
This simulation is really helping me visualize how Newton's laws work in a practical way.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered Newton's laws, forces, and friction.
Right.
But there's another layer to this simulation we haven't even touched yet. Moments in rotation.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how those concepts come into play.
This is where things get even more interesting. You see, pushing a file cabinet isn't just about moving it in a straight line. Depending on where and how you push, you can cause it to tip over as well.
Really? So even pushing a file cabinet can be more complex than I thought. I'm all ears. Tell me more about these moments and how they affect the cabinet's movement.
It all comes down to leverage. Imagine pushing on a door. If you push close to the hinges, it takes a lot more force to open it than if you push near the handle.
Yeah.
That's because you're creating a larger moment or rotational force when you push further from the pivot point.
So it's like how a longer wrench gives you more leverage when you're trying to loosen a bolt.
Exactly. And the simulation takes these moments into account. It actually calculates the moments created by your pushing force and considers whether they'll cause the cabinet to rotate or even tip over.
Wow. So depending on the angle and position of my push, the cabinet might just slide, or it might end up on its side. That's pretty cool. But I'm a visual learner. Does the simulation actually show these moments in action?
It does. You can see how the cabinet reacts differently based on where and how you apply force.
Okay.
If you push too high, you might create a moment that causes it to tip backward. If you push too low, it might tip forward.
So there's a sweet spot where you're applying enough force to overcome static friction and get the cabinet moving, but not so much force in a way that creates a moment strong enough to cause it to tip over.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance of forces. And the simulation allows you to experiment with different pushing positions and angles to see how it affects the cabinet's behavior. It even highlights the center of gravity so you can visualize how that plays a role in stability.
I'm starting to realize there's a lot more to pushing a file cabinet than meets the eye.
Right. It's a great example of how seemingly simple actions are governed by these complex interactions of forces.
This simulation is really opening my eyes to the physics all around us. So we've got Newton's laws, forces, friction, and now moments. Anything else this simulation can teach us about the physics at play here?
Well, there are a few more subtle things to consider.
Like what?
For instance, the simulation uses a two-dimensional model.
Okay.
Which is a simplification.
Right.
In reality, the file cabinet exists in 3 dimensions, and there are other factors that could come into play, like uneven weight distribution or the surface texture of the floor.
So this simulation provides a really great foundation for understanding the core concepts, but there's always more nuance to explore in the real world.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool for learning.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that it's still a model, and models have their limitations.
That's a good point. It's a reminder that even with advanced simulations, there's still so much more to learn about the complexities of the physical world.
Couldn't agree more. That's what makes physics so fascinating.
Yeah.
There's always another layer to peel back, another question to ask.
Okay, so before we wrap up our deep dive into this simulation, I wanted to touch on something that's been bugging me.
Oh.
We've spent all this time talking about pushing the file cabinet, but what about pulling it?
Okay.
Does that change the forces and moments involved?
That's a great question, and it highlights how even a slight change in how we interact with an object can significantly impact the forces at play. When you pull an object, you're essentially changing the direction of the applied force.
Okay, so how does that change in direction affect things?
Well, think about it this way. When you pull a file cabinet, you're likely applying the force at an upward angle. This can actually help reduce the moment that would cause the cabinet to tip forward.
So pulling could make it less likely to tip over. That's interesting. But does it make it easier or harder to move overall?
That's where things get a bit more nuanced. Pulling at an upward angle could reduce friction, making the cabinet easier to move. However, if you pull at too steep of an angle, you might end up lifting the cabinet slightly, which would increase the normal force and in turn increase friction.
So there's a sweet spot for the angle of the pull too.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right balance between minimizing friction and avoiding an excessive upward force.
Wow. I'm starting to see how much thought goes into even the simplest actions. It's like a whole physics puzzle.
It really is. And the cool thing is that this simulation lets you play around with those variables, the angle of the push or pull, the amount of force applied, even the surface friction, and see how they affect the outcome.
I'm definitely going to spend some time experimenting with that. Thanks for guiding me through this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey into the world of physics and forces.
My pleasure. And remember, physics isn't just about textbooks and equations.
Right.
It's all around us, even in something as simple as pushing or pulling a file cabinet.
I'll never look at a file cabinet the same way again. It's amazing how this simulation has taken something as seemingly mundane as pushing a file cabinet and turned it into a playground for exploring physics concepts.
Yeah, that's the beauty of simulations like this.
Right.
They give us a safe and controlled environment to experiment and really grasp these ideas that might otherwise feel abstract or overwhelming.
It's like having a virtual physics lab right at our fingertips.
Exactly.
I'm curious, are there other real-world examples where understanding these forces of static and kinetic friction is particularly important?
Oh, absolutely.
Like what?
Take driving, for instance.
Okay.
Anti-lock braking systems, or ABS, rely heavily on the interplay between static and kinetic friction to maximize stopping power.
I've heard of ABS, but I've never really thought about how it works. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. When you slam on your brakes, your wheels can lock up, causing them to skid. When a wheel skids, it's experiencing kinetic friction with the road surface. But static friction, remember, is stronger.
Right, so if the wheels are locked and skidding, they're not gripping the road as effectively.
Exactly. What ABS does is it rapidly pumps the brakes,
There.
essentially switching between static and kinetic friction many times per second.
Oh, wow.
This prevents the wheels from locking up completely, allowing the tires to maintain a stronger grip on the road and shortening the stopping distance.
Wow, that's incredible. I never realized how crucial understanding those different types of friction is to something as essential as braking safely.
And it goes beyond driving, too. Think about sports. In basketball,
Yeah.
players rely on static friction to pivot quickly.
Right.
And in baseball, pitchers use it to grip the ball and throw curveballs.
This is really making me appreciate how physics is truly everywhere.
Yeah.
We may not always think about it,
Right.
but these principles are constantly at work, influencing even the simplest actions.
It's all about taking that deeper dive, looking beyond the surface, and recognizing those underlying forces shaping our world.
I have to say, this deep dive into the physics of pushing a file cabinet has been surprisingly insightful. It's made me realize that even the most ordinary actions can be fascinating when you look at them through the lens of physics.
And that's what we hope to achieve with these deep dives, to spark curiosity,
Yeah.
to challenge assumptions, and to inspire you to explore the world around you with a newfound sense of wonder.
Well, mission accomplished. I'm definitely leaving this deep dive with a lot more knowledge and a lot more questions. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
My pleasure. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking those insightful questions.